So let me just remind you what the point of it was last time. We went very rapidly through the development of commodity money, then the development of tokens, that is to say, in which you, instead of taking gold to pay for someone, you can have a piece of paper that says, this is as good as gold. In fact, the goldsmiths used to originally issue such pieces of paper. So if you kept your gold with a goldsmith and you want to buy something, it would make no sense for you to take the gold out of the goldsmith and take it to spend it. It'd be easier for the goldsmith to say, I have the gold and I as a goldsmith am a valid backer of this piece of paper, and that paper becomes a chit for gold, a token of gold, and you can then pay with it as long as you have faith in the goldsmith. So then the goldsmith in another town has to be connected to the goldsmith in this town, and so on. In this way, the circulation of paper money can take the place of real money, commodity money, as long as it can be backed by gold, in the sense that you can take it back and get gold for it. Notice I have not said in any moment, I'll come to you in a second, I have not said at any moment anything about the state. All of these things arose historically without the state and prior to the state, because exchange comes from, Adam Smith says, the intercourse of individuals in exchange, and it's not invented by the state. Some Keynesians especially like to imagine that money was invented by the state because it gives the state more power and they tend to be pro-state. But it seems to me that's the wrong way to proceed. It's very easy to establish historically, and I showed you some of the pictures earlier. Money comes out of exchange, and tokens come out of money, and then credit comes out of that, and so on and so on. Now, credit can come prior to tokens, but the point is that these come out of exchange. Yes, you had a question.
Is there any ethnographic evidence that you know of that?
I mentioned the book by J. Allison Quiggins,
right,
which is called Primitive Money, and she's an anthropologist,
right,
so it's literally ethnographic evidence about the origins and rise of money.
Right, I mean, but it seems like throughout that book, she's not making the claim that there was a generalized exchange in those economies necessarily.
No, not at all.
Right, so I guess my question is, where is the evidence, I guess, that that form of generalized exchange comes, or it develops naturally, and then the money...
No, let me be clear. Perhaps I said repeatedly when I was talking about Smith that the root and early state is a fiction, anthropological fiction. It never existed.
Right.
And Ricardo doesn't pick it up that way. He picks it up as an analytical stage. And Marx makes it very clear this is not meant to be historical, but meant to be analytical. However, the point is that exchange itself poses the issue of money and develops it, even though it is not this rude and early state type exchange, but rather takes place initially between tribes, and then within tribes or within small villages and towns develops, and that exchange already carries with it the need for money. It doesn't require generalized commodity production. On the contrary, money develops fairly early, and generalized commodity production doesn't develop until capitalism develops. But if you understand this way, then you understand that when capitalism develops, money is already there. It didn't invent money, that's for sure. But the properties of money then get taken over by another property, which is money to make money. Money no longer becomes a medium of exchange, but becomes a means of exchange, rather, becomes a means of profit. And that changes, so to speak, the significance of money. In the same sense that if someone uses a gun to hunt rabbits or a gun to shoot people, it changes the significance of the gun, but not the gun itself. Okay, that's the point I'm getting headed towards now. We're going to be talking about that. But in the process, I inevitably, especially in this course, have to skip over the beautiful elaboration of forms of money. that take place even historically prior to capitalism. Credit comes prior to capitalism. State money comes prior to capitalism. Certainly the different money commodities that I mentioned, including the development of silver and gold and bronze and all of that, comes prior to capitalism. Capitalism takes that over. And to know what it takes over, we need to first understand how these things have developed, because it doesn't abolish the need. It transforms its use, but the need is still there. I don't know if that answered your question. Okay. Yeah, and reserve it for when we come to profit, because it's going to come up again, okay? Now, one of the problems I didn't elaborate upon, which is an interesting issue, is of course what happens when money is no longer tied to commodities. And that's different from saying when money is no longer backed by the state. I made the point that money can be backed by gold as a commodity if gold is a money commodity, or silver, or flying fox jaws, or whatever. All of those can be money, and tokens can be backed by it, and even credit can be backed by it, either because the state backs it or because the market backs it. And the market backing can be, in effect, the state backing is a fixed exchange rate. When the state backs a currency, it says, give me that token and I'll give you some gold or silver or bronze or copper, whatever it is, or tobacco for it, or salt. When the market backs it, you can perform the same operation, but instead of going to the bank window of the state bank, you go to the bank window of a private bank, and you can buy gold. Or you go to the goldsmith and you can buy gold. So the issue of backing of gold is not the same thing as the state backing gold. In one case, the gold is backed at a fixed exchange rate. The state says $45 an ounce and I can give you gold if you want it. Or the market says $45 an ounce, come into my shop and I'll give you some gold. That's the difference of the convertible, of the fixed or flexible exchange rate is often called convertible or inconvertible. And that's a misnomer because it's always convertible in the market. What they mean is convertible at the state bank window or inconvertible at the state bank window, which is not the same thing as saying convertible, inconvertible anywhere. Now, when money is no longer related to a money commodity, you can still express the relations that I developed last time in the same way, but the question changes. The question then becomes what determines the price level? And the gold price then is determined by what determines the price level. The order of causation changes. So what am I talking about? I'm talking about modern money. Modern money that in which any connection to commodities is, as a particular commodity money is abolished. Obviously money is connected to commodities, because if it wasn't, you wouldn't need the money either. So the connection is no longer to any particular money commodity. The price of gold, let's call it that, it's the money commodity, we use gold as a shorthand for that, is then determined by the price level, not the other way around. Now, one way of looking at it is that raises the question of what determines the price level when you have no connection to commodity money, and I would argue that that is the question, in fact, in Keynes and Milton Friedman, but the answer is not the same. The answer is not the same because in Keynes and in Friedman and in Keynesians and neoclassicals, the answer is roughly like this, not post-Keynesian, but roughly the Keynesians. If I pump up the economy by adding more money to it, let's say the state runs a deficit, then one of two things can happen. Either the economy output can expand, or output can reach some limit, in which case prices will expand. Everybody understand that? That's basic macro. In the neoclassical argument, we're always at the limit because we're at full employment or effective full employment or the Nehru or whatever. So if I pump it up, I'm going to get inflation. So I pump up anything beyond the growth rate of Nehru growth rate of the economy, I'm going to get inflation. That's Friedman through all the developments, Friedman, Phelps, Lucas, and all of that. That's about some rate that is a limit. Keynes argues, no, if you pump up the economy, I will reach full employment and then I will have inflation. So the Keynesians argue that you won't have inflation if there's unemployment. The neoclassicals say, I don't see any unemployment. Every person who's unemployed is choosing not to work, and therefore everybody is employed. They tend to say this quietly away from areas of high unemployment because they would probably be lynched. So it's easier for them to be academics when they say this. But the fact is that they essentially make the same argument. They disagree about whether there is full employment or not, but for them they are always there. Keynesians, you can get there. Now what's interesting is that you can't make that argument in Marx, and we're going to come to this point, but it's relevant to where we are now. You cannot make the argument that labor is the limit to production, because later on, in volume 1 of Capital, chapter 25, he develops an argument called the reserve army of labor. And the argument is specifically that capital is not limited by the supply of labor. If there's a shortage of labor, more people can be induced to work. That is to say, people like women can be brought in, and even children in some circumstances. That's a common thing in wars. Or they can be imported from other places. Or they can be freed, so-called, in quotation marks, by replacing workers with machinery. And that frees them and throws them back into the reserve army. So the reserve army is fed by the supply of labor, by the immigration of labor, by the changing of the labor participation rate, more women, more non-whites brought in when you need them and then kicked back out when you don't, and by the displacement of labor through machinery. If that argument is correct, then you cannot use in Marx the argument that inflation is a full employment phenomenon, right? Everybody see that? So you cannot have Marxist theory of inflation the same as Keynes or Friedman. And that raises a very interesting question. Inflation is there, clearly. So how do we understand the limit to production? And the answer is the limit to production comes from profitability. I will establish, I probably won't establish how, you'll have to buy my book, but I will briefly remember to tell you, I hope, what that issue is. But that brings us to the question today, which is profitability. Because in order for this argument to go forward, if the limit is profitability, you have to develop where profit comes from. And then you have to show how profit affects growth. And then you have to show why growth might not change, or under what conditions it won't change, if you increase demand. Everybody see that? So the path, there is a path, but it's not going to be the conventional split between neoclassicals and Keynesians. Post-Keynesians are not very different. They say that prices are created by markups on costs, but costs are prices of other goods and wages. But the prices of other goods can be broken into wages and the prices of other goods. Remember, we did this vertical integration. So ultimately, post-Keynesians say, prices depend on wages, plus the direct and indirect markup. But if that is stable, then the only way prices can change is wages change. But then, if there's full employment, the pressure is on the labor markets, wages change, and so inflation is caused by labor. Not by the sellers of commodities in the commodity market, but by workers demanding higher wages when the employment gets tight. So the post-Keynesian argument is interesting because it says inflation comes from labor, whereas the Keynes's argument, it says that inflation comes from capital. And the same thing for, well, Friedman is a little bit more complex, but anyway, the point is that the two identify labor still with full employment, but the source of the increase in the price is different. Okay? Now, in Marx, neither argument can hold because the reserve army of labor messes up that whole route. But I would argue it opens up a rather wonderful and elegant alternate explanation of inflation, which I will try to mention as I go along, but not this lecture. Okay? Any other questions? I wanted to wrap up the money issue because people always think about modern money, but modern money is very specific. It's fiat money. It's created by the state and is created through the banking system. Using the fiat money as reserves can create purchasing power. So the issue is not money, but purchasing power. That's the key. So to develop the theory, the classical theory of inflation, you need to balance the increase of purchasing power, either the printing of money through government deficit spending, creation of purchasing power, or through private banks, creation of purchasing power. And that creation is quite enormous. If you want to read a conservative take on this, read the book by David Stockman called The Great Deformation. He was the budget director for Ronald Reagan and one of the great proponents of what Reagan did, and now has taken a different view entirely of capitalism, which he feels has been utterly deformed by the creation of purchasing power through government printing of money and private credit bank printing. So I don't, and he's still, and so he argues we should go back to gold. Interesting argument. Pardon?
So he's kind of an Austrian in a way?
Well, he sort of moved back towards that. It is true that he says that he himself became a hedge fund manager and did a lot about creating purchasing power with no material foundation. But his hedge fund went bankrupt and he got into trouble, and now he has seen a different light. So it's an interesting, but it's a very thick book, but sold very well and put him on the talk show circuit, which makes tons of money. So going back to the gold standard is always popular in the conservative circles. Yes?
So you said that gold is always convertible, whether it's the market.
Well, but see, that's inconsistent with capitalism. The people who offer gold are professional gold dealers. You can take a trip sometime, it's a good trip by the way, go down to 42nd Street, 48th Street I think it is, in between Broadway and something, and you walk along and you'll see every shop is a gold seller. They are people who make their money by selling you gold. Gold is their profit item. For them to refuse to sell you gold is another way of saying they will commit suicide, and there's no point in that because they're in the business of making money by selling gold. And what they do is they buy gold from other people. Everybody, there is no moment where everybody in the world will refuse to sell gold. It just changes the price, the supply of gold. Secondly, gold is produced. It's a product coming out of mines. And you don't produce gold in mines to sit on it. You produce it for one reason only, so you can turn it into something you can use to buy. So in fact, historically, and the question you asked is a good one, is Marx raises this issue. Historically, when there is a so-called shortage of gold, which is reflected in when gold is in market price based and the price goes up, there's a tremendous incentive for people to take gold in jewelry and what's called plate and so on, and melt it down and sell it for bullion. And vice versa, when the price of bullion drops, there's an incentive to take that bullion and put it into jewelry. And this especially becomes important with silver, let's say in a country like India, and now gold, where the metal goes back and forth between those two forms according to prices. I mean, if the price of gold has gone from 400 to 1600, well, hell, the jewelry your family gave you, you know, and that's great, but it's worth a lot of money now, and you will certainly be willing to part with it, I guarantee that. Same thing with land, by the way. The price goes up enough, people suddenly decide the old family home, well, let's burn it down and sell the land because it's worth a lot of money. Any other questions? Okay, so now, today is Halloween, as you know. And when you come out of here, the streets of New York are going to be full of very scary things. But, and by the way, you can't walk west because the subways are closed. You have to walk east. So this is a day of scary things, and what could be more appropriate than talking about the theory of profit, a truly scary thing. The first thing about profit, or prior to profit, is the argument in Marx that class itself rests on surplus labor. Because he needs that argument as a foundation for the argument that profit is a form of surplus labor. It's the modern capitalist expression of surplus labor. So what is this thing of profit being or of surplus labor being the foundation of class? Well, intuitively, it's a simple argument. It says that in order for a class of people to exist who don't work, that has to be a class of people who do work, who produce more than they themselves need in order to support this other class. So in this sort of very Walt Disney version of the story, ruling classes require the labor of the producers to be greater than the amount that the producers need to live, or the producers are permitted to get to live, because need is an issue that becomes relevant only if you can decide on it. But what you are permitted to keep and what you have to turn over of your product is equivalent to what you're permitted to keep of your labor time and how much you turn over. Everybody can see that sort of intuitively, right? And this is key to Marx's point that the central issue is the length of the working day. Because the more people work in a particular day under particular conditions, the more they can produce. For any given standard living, that means the more likely it is for them to produce more than that standard living, and the question will become, why would they do that? One answer is that they could want to save a little bit for the future. This is your classical answer. You store things up and all that, but that's just building up stocks. That's not the same thing as you continue to work 18 hours a day in order to consume only 4 hours of that product. Once you put it that way, then you're asking what are the social relations that induce people, I'm using a neutral term, induce people to work much longer than they need for their own collective reproduction. To put it another way, what induces the producers to perform surplus labor time?
When you say producers, you mean labor?
Pardon?
Or when you say producers, you mean workers?
I mean the producers, because they're not yet workers, because workers is a specific capitalist category, right? So peasants are producers, but they're not workers. Yes, yeah. The performance of labor, in the productive labor especially, we're talking about, but generally labor. So this little handout here is designed, and I don't think I did it here, but now my memory skips these days. So consider a simple case, which is on the handout, in which it takes 1 bushel of, the simple case involves corn with labor, corn as seed, and labor used to make corn output, right? So 1 bushel of corn plus 1 hour of labor will result in some period thereafter in 2 bushels of corn. In other words, you go in, you plant the corn, you do the work, you wait, you harvest the corn. Obviously, the hour is not relevant. It can be days, it can be years, but the point is it's a labor time involved and a physical quantity of material goods involved, right? And obviously, we can make this a vector of inputs, we can have a vector of labor times, a vector of outputs, and you gain nothing except the impression that a vector makes things more sophisticated, which it doesn't. So, if that's the case, then if I work 1 hour, this is labor, then I will require input of 1 bushel. I will have an output of 2 bushels, and I will have a net product of 1 bushel, because the net product is the difference between my output and my input. Okay? Now, what is of consequence for any ruling entity is what is the surplus product. So we need to know what is the necessary product, what Marx calls a necessary product, which is the part of this output that is needed to reproduce the labor. And that doesn't mean reproduce at a nice standard living, or not talking of health clubs and spas necessarily. It can be reproduced in conditions of absolute misery. It's whatever labor the producers are forced to or talked into bearing. And I'm going to come back to the question of why they would do that. Well, let's suppose that the necessary product, the wage, is 4 bushels per hour. Well, if that's 4 bushels for 1 hour, then, because we have 1 hour of input, then the surplus product is, which is the net product minus the necessary product, is 1 minus 4 is minus 3. What does it mean, a net product, a surplus product minus 3? It means that you have to run down your stocks. Because you're actually producing a net product which is less than the amount that is necessary to reproduce the labor. Which means in the next round you have to give 4 to reproduce this, and you can only do that if you run down stocks. Everybody with me here? So intuitively, just with this simple schema, how many hours do you have to work? It's not intuitive, I already wrote it out, but anyway, you can figure this out. How many hours do you need to work to just reproduce the cost of labor and the raw materials of those hours? It's clear, it's 4, right? 4 hours, then your input is 4 bushels, output is 8 bushels, net product is 8 minus 4, so that's 4 bushels. And the necessary product is always 4 bushels, necessary product is, I said 4 bushels per hour. What I meant is 4 bushels per producer. So that's 4 bushels for the producers. And the surplus product is 4 minus 4, which is 0. Okay, you can see the logic here. And so far we're not talking about workers, it could be peasants, it could be slaves. We're talking about the relation between labor time and output and the cost of that labor time in terms of inputs and the necessary product. So this quantity of labor time Marx calls necessary labor time. Now notice I'm not saying surplus value later or anything, or value of labor power. This is a purely general thing in terms of just labor time and product. We haven't come to commodities and exchange or anything like that. Okay? Well, it's clear that from the point of view of the users of the surplus product, this is not a sufficient length of the working day. Clear that if you went to 8 hours, I'm going to skip all the intermediate steps since I've already done that there, and you get 4 bushels of surplus labor. If you do 12 hours, you get 8 bushels. So, hang on one second, let people catch up. Everybody with me here? Yeah.
Why is the 4 hours a necessary labor time and not 1 or 8? Is per?
Because that's the number of hours that it would take to produce just enough to support the workers who do it.
So
The producers who do it.
So necessary here means the amount of time necessary to.
It's the necessary length of the working day. That's not the same thing as socially necessary labor time. It's a necessary length of the working day. It's a number of hours that the producers would have to be induced, I'm using a neutral term, induced to work in order to just maintain themselves and the raw materials they use up in the process. Okay?
So,
Yeah.
so it's not just the wages for the labor, it's the wages and input material.
There's no wages, not necessarily, I said W, but it's just the standard living of the producers, the people who do the work. I mean, if nothing else, if you were running, if you were a lord and these were peasants, right? And you knew that in your village, if the peasants worked 4 hours a day, you get enough corn to keep the peasants alive, but not you. You can see that from their point of view, that's good enough because that's the standard living you're giving them. They've already replaced that in the first 4 hours. It's any hour of labor after that that becomes, so to speak, the foundation for the lord, the surplus labor time. Because every hour after that begins to produce a surplus product, and that surplus product is the material basis for the whole social structure that stands on top of this production process. the rest on top of it. Yes?
But he was asking for input, so we had one, as input we have 1 bushel per 2 bushels, right?
1 bushel, yes, 1 bushel
So
for
we
2
have
bushels,
input
1
that
bushel
needs
per
to be
hour
reduced.
of work.
Yeah.
1 hour of work, yeah.
So we have input that is not.
Yes, yes, absolutely. This is, think of it as corn, seed, right?
Yeah.
You sow the seed. So was that your question? Did I misunderstand that?
I thought this was just, the 4 bushels were just for the wages, but then you already included the input, the cost of the input in
Right,
your
right.
equation, right?
So think of it, 4 hours of work requires 4 bushels as seed, right? So that's your raw materials. It leads to 8 bushels of corn. Of that 8 bushels, only 4 is net because 4 of it has to go back to replace the seed. Then 4 of it has to replace the cost of the labor. So that's another 4 out and your surplus product is 0. Okay? So it's all input, output is everything taken care of here. Yes?
I think it's important to note that that's not really wage per se, but it doesn't depend on
That's right.
hours.
It's not a wage, and you're right, I should not call this W, let's call it standard living. Though standard living has a kind of connotation of spas and so on, which I don't like either, but anyway, it's not meant to be wage because it need not be wage labor. It's a very California term, at least in my mind. Okay. So clearly, the connection between hours and surplus labor time depends on who's running the process. That should be obvious. If you have a ruling class, then they depend on this, then they must have a powerful incentive to push this to the maximum. Is that point clear? Secondly, obviously if I cut the standard living of the producers, then I have more surplus product too. So there's a powerful incentive to keep the standard living of the producers down in order to expand the share of the product that goes to the ruling groups. So then the question arises, what's the limit? What's the limit of the wage, of the standard living of producers? How low can it go? And what's the limit of the working day? How high can it go? What determines those things? Okay, let me ask you this question differently. What's the average length of the working day in the factory that makes this? Foxconn in China.
36 hours.
How long? What's the average working day in there? 16 hours. One holiday or 1 day off a week, but only when the demand is not high. Sometimes no days off. 16 hours working at a high intensity. By the way, I haven't mentioned the idea of the intensity of labor, you know, the speed up that comes there. We're going to get to that later. What's the average wage in China in this factory?
$100 a month.
Yeah, but let's say an hour. It's like $2.17 or $2.70 or somewhere in the order. It's less than $3 an hour. Now, that raises a very interesting question. 16 hours a day, less than $3 an hour. Why? To put it differently, why is there an 8-hour working day in the United States in some sectors? There are plenty of sectors nowadays where it's not 8 hours a day. And why is there a wage?
Lower cost of living, John?
Anarchists threw bombs at cops.
Yes, but how long did that take?
How long was it?
How long did it take to get the wage up in the United States from 16 hours a day and the equivalent of $2 an hour to the present? You need to know your labor history.
When you
need-
say to the present, because the 8-hour working day has long since deceased from
No, the 8-hour working day came about fairly recently. In the 1880s, for instance, the working day was not 8 hours, it
Right.
was 16 hours, 14 to 16 hours.
But I mean, that struggle was one in the late 1800s / early 1900s.
No, it didn't go to 8, it went down little by little over time. And that's why you guys really need, and we need a course in this place, in this department on labor history.
Yes.
Because this is an issue of deep and incessant struggle, fighting, blood, not just, talking about it. Organizing, being shot by the cops, being beaten up. And then, by the way, this happens still in the United States, and it happens all over the world regularly, that any attempt to unionize will be met by force. If all other things fail, including discouraging people and so on, can be met by force. And the history of labor is replete with the struggle to increase the portion going to the producers and to reduce the working day on the side of the producers, and the struggle to push down the standard of living and increase the length of the working day on the other side. The point being that this is a class struggle in the labor process. It's not some abstract thing that happens. It's very concrete and it's very well established, and it's happening now all across the world. And this comes about not because of the meanness of the rulers and the niceness of the producers, but in fact because they have completely opposing structural needs and incentives. That's a very important point. When you end up working on Wall Street, as some section of you will, and you end up cheating some grandmother of her pension, as some section of you will, I will say it's not because you're really a rotten person, but you're doing a good job in the milieu you're in. I will actually say you're a rotten person, but that's a separate issue. You'll become a rotten person, but you're doing a good job, and you'll be rewarded for it, possibly enormously for doing just that. That's the key point. I saw a hand somewhere. Yes?
But is it not the issue with Marx when you talk about he introduced technology, that people unionize, eat up the profit, then the capitalists will find the way to cut costs by technology?
Okay, wait, we haven't come to capitalists yet. We're talking about sort of human society in general. This includes peasantry, this includes slave society, it includes all kinds of social forms in Asia and Africa. The point he's making is more general, that if you have a class that lives off the wealth of the society, it has to be able to force the producers of that wealth, the productive labor, to only get a portion of what they produce. And one mechanism, not the primary one on the surface, is force. But in fact, the primary one is something quite different. The immediate one is not that. It's not force. Force is a last instance. Force is very expensive, by the way. As we find out in the US with the multiple daily wars, it's quite expensive to beat people down. They might even try to do the same thing to you. There's a better way, which is to persuade them that their place is correct, that what they get is deserved. And you do that not through force, but through the whole social apparatus that inculcates you in the idea that you are, if you do well, it's because you did it. If you do badly, because you did it. That structure, which we call the church, the state, the school system, professors, that's the job. Yeah, to keep you, HR, to keep you in your place. And that's the best way, by the way, and that's obviously why religion and class structure are intertwined. Not every person who is in a church or in a religious group is, of course, part of that, but the structure of these groups and their ties to the ruling structure are very well established. They adapt, and they serve the purpose. Now, where do you then get to be free of all of this, at least in the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition? Heaven, right. So how do you get to heaven? Don't cause trouble on earth. Do your job, be good, obey orders, and of course give money to the religious groups, that's very important, and you will go to heaven. But keep your place, that's a key point. So someone like Marx coming to all of this is already coming from the idea that the social structures that evolved to support ruling classes are part of a whole. That does not mean they're identical, doesn't mean that every incentive is the same or they don't fight among each other or anything like that. But the fact is that they are quite organically related to each other. And one of the things that they do, surely not the only thing, is to ensure the reproductions of the social relations that allow you to get surplus labor time. We saw the Monty Python clip here, right, of the king and the peasantry. Well, the whole point of that is, of course, that the king thinks, rightfully so, that he's king because he's king. And Monty Python's having a lot of fun with our presumption by saying, yeah, but the peasants are saying, well, I didn't elect you king. And he goes, kings are not elected. Of course not, kings are not elected. And that point is a theme that runs throughout sort of Marx's view of the development of class and the material basis of class. Now, there are many more complications, which I'm only hinting here because I want to use this as a point to get into the question of capitalist profit. But the key point is the same. There has to be a set of mechanisms that induce some amount of a working day which allows me to have some amount of surplus labor time and some amount of surplus product. Obviously, if the necessary working day is 4, then the surplus labor time between here and here is 4. The surplus labor time between 4 and 12 is 8, and so on. So there's a correspondence between the length of the working day and the amount of the product, which goes from 0 to 4 to 8. Surplus product, okay? And that's a key point that Marx is making. It doesn't require the numbers to be exactly constant, the constant proportions. Oh, these are trivial details. The point is, there's a directional relation here. And the limits then become very crucial. The lower limit to the wage is what the classical economists call the subsistence wage, which is historically achieved, but just barely enough to keep people going. The upper limit is, of course, if you increase the wage, you cut into the surplus product. Remember Ricardo's point, if wages go up beyond a certain point, the capitalists would never tolerate it, so you got the tremendous resistance from the surplus, from the users of the surplus product, from the ruling groups, to the pressure to move the standard of living of the producers up. So these limits come about and it cannot be established by anything other than the social struggle. There's a biological limit, subsistence limit, it's true. But by the way, even that doesn't necessarily hold. We know perfectly well that the Europeans who invaded Latin America found tribes there working and worked them literally to death because they had enough of them, they could work them, and as they died, they could replace them. There was no standard of living subsistence. They were below subsistence and worked long enough so that they literally died from those labors, and we know that history is well established. Okay? Any questions about this part, which is just the derivation of the relation between surplus labor time and surplus product? Yes?
How did this distribution of wealth from a certain production activity come to place in like, way from the beginning? So if I'm an entrepreneur or a capitalist, why do I deserve to get a bigger share? Even
First of all, in the beginning there were no capitalists, so that's a very important point.
When the accumulation of capital started.
Okay, but let me pose a question differently. Suppose I would say when they were first kings, right? Because there was feudal society before capitalist society, or the first slave owners. There was that society also before feudal society and capitalist society. So the question you're asking is a more general question: why would people put up with this? Or what gives rise to this inversion of relationships in which some people have the right, so-called right, to take a portion of the product? And the point I'm making is that that is the development of a social structure in which that right is enforced. Enforced in more than one way, by ideology, by education, by religion, and if need be, by force.
What's the benefit behind it? What's
Benefits too?
If I'm an entrepreneur, I have no value without my workers. Actually, they do.
No, don't go to entrepreneur. Suppose you're a king.
I'm
Okay, suppose you're a king, you're noble.
yeah, do I have any value with whatever capital I have or land I have without the workers?
Well, again, there's no capital. You're translating everything back from capitalism to the dawn of human history, which I've tried to avoid doing for a reason, because I want to challenge these ideas of capital and entrepreneur and all of that, okay? So ask this question. Why would a noble, self-proclaimed noble, as the whole point of the Monty Python thing, right? Self-proclaimed noble, want to extract surplus labor? The answer is so obvious and trivial. You couldn't be a noble unless somebody did that. You couldn't have your house, you couldn't have your fine wines, your food, your servants, your horses, your army, and all of that. Somebody has to pay for it. Not in money, but have to pay for it in real terms. And Marx's point is that payment comes in this surplus labor time. Now, you can ask the question from the other side. Why the hell are these peasants doing it? Why don't they just get up and, like in the Monty Python script, and say, you know, bugger off. I'm an anarchist, so go to hell. Well, the answer is very clear. The Monty Python script makes that point clear already. The violence inherent in the system. You don't decide. You don't choose to be a peasant. You are born into it, but you can try to leave and they will hunt you down. Because obviously, if people left, the lords wouldn't be able to survive. Now, if they left, they also wouldn't have access to the land because the land has been appropriated by the lords, who say it's our land. So then they would also have this difficulty of not being able to live. Does that answer? I want you to keep the entrepreneurial mentality out of this.
Okay, but what keeps supporting that and holding this relationship?
Okay, ask yourself this. How many people have seen 12 Years a Slave, the movie just came out? No?
Just a share.
What's it for to go to the movie?
Pardon?
What's it for to go to the movie?
Yeah, you're for to go, but it'll be on YouTube in 10 seconds. You can check it out. So, it's about a man who's a black man who's a free man, who's kidnapped, I think it's in Massachusetts, and sold. He meets some people who tell him they want to do something with him, and then the people actually drug him and they sell him as a slave. And once he's a slave, he's a black man, he can't get out. Where's he gonna go? He lives in a culture where if he tried to escape, he would be hunted down and tortured and killed. And moreover, everyone around him would immediately know that because he's black, he's not a normal free person, and he would be killed. And so it takes 12 years for him to break free of this, even though in another part of the United States, he was a free man. That's the answer. You know, it's only in the movies that Vin Diesel can break out of any prison and make it out. It's not so simple in real life, because everyone around you is going to collaborate in keeping you in your place, including people who are like you, who of course have a big penalty if they don't. So how do you escape? And the answer is virtually impossible. We all love movies where people escape. I mean, you know, Robin Hood, wonderful. He joins all these people. Of course, he's a noble, and he's only pissed off because his nobility, his surplus product has been taken by the Lord. But he joins all these people, and they're all out there shooting arrows at the sheriff and all that, and they live in the forest. And the reason they get away with that, at least in the story, is because it's difficult to control the forest. So yes, people can escape on the edges of society. People have been known even in areas where they were slaves to escape into the swamps and live there. But you can't do that en masse. That's the problem. And notice here that the key element is a whole social structure that keeps you in your place. It's not individual. Your best friend may turn you in, because otherwise the penalty for them not having told could be fatal. So we know this history very well. I mean, at least you should know this history well, because it's well established. And the point is that in Marx's argument, a similar set of binding structures takes place in capitalism. But the form is different. It's not the direct shackling of a slave. It's not the tying of the peasant to the land, but something else, which is the separation between the worker, this now the producer becomes the worker, and the ability of that worker to operate without the plant and equipment and materials and money it takes to be a producer in a capitalist society. Now again, that's social. It's social. workers who came from Europe came to the United States. They didn't bring their capitalists with them. They were trying to escape them by and large, though capitalists came also. And they came in good part because coming here would not only free them from those social relations where you couldn't walk on your village and everybody knew who you were supposed to be working for and all of that. You come here and you can have a job in a different condition or possibly work for yourself because the land hasn't been fully taken up, or better yet, kill some Native Americans and take their land. And then you're free. That's the history. Latin America is populated that way, by the way. Depopulated and repopulated that way. So it's not a personal question, it's a social question. Does that answer your question roughly? The problem that Marx is going to pose is, how is it possible in a society in which you are not bound to a particular job, unlike, say, a feudal society where you can't walk off, or in a caste society where you can't choose to be another caste, or a slave society where you can't choose to be not a slave? How are you bound? And his answer is, you're bound by the fact that you don't have access to the means of production in the same degree. Now, you might have some tools, you might be able to live on something, but if you have land, you may have some space for that, but collectively, the working class as a whole cannot leave that because that's the source of their income upon which they live. And so he argues that you get the same relations that you have in the other societies, but not this time through a mandatory binding, but through the same element which is crucial in that, which is a unequal distribution, what he calls a class monopoly, but it's not monopoly in the pure sense, but a class concentration of the means of production. Now, in modern visions of capitalism, anybody can become a capitalist, and you can. All of you could become capitalists, and people who work for a living can become a capitalist. So what is it then that keeps this structure alive? If anybody can choose to be a capitalist, and any capitalist can choose to go and work in McDonald's. Well, it's pretty easy to see why they won't want to work in McDonald's, but it's harder to see why people in McDonald's can simply find their way up to the top. But let me pose the question differently. Could everybody who is a wage laborer become a capitalist? Well, obviously not, because for them to become capitalist, somebody would have to be wage labor. There has to be some social mechanism here, right? Individual people, sure. Everybody, no, because then you'd have this problem that the necessary workforce and the structure of that and the education of that wouldn't be there. Could everybody decide to, say, become self-employed producers? Well, possibly, but it would be pretty hard to do, because what would you live on? The key point, again, is that there are social structures that keep you in your place. They're like invisible magnetic fields, and you think you're doing what you're doing because you are a completely independent person and you are totally unique, and then you go out and buy the same damn jeans that everybody buys, but it's your choice. God knows you made it, you thought about it, and you're unique. Unique in a maximum way. Look today on the street and see how many people are indeed unique and how many people are wearing the same mask that everyone else is, thinking that they're being different. Okay? Well, that's what social structures do. They induce you to operate in the way that's necessary, and violence is only the last instance. And I have to mention this point. Violence is only the last instance, but it's there. In any time in the history when there were struggles about place, the place of gay people in the society, the place of black people in the society, the place of women in the society, the place of workers in the society, efforts to break out of their place have been met not only by social pressure, but also by violence. And that history is also very well established. Violence. So that's the binding element. It's invisible because it looks like it's not there, but you try going beyond it and you suddenly discover it is there. Yes?
I'm struck when you said, by what you said about violence being the last instance. To me, violence seems almost to be the first instance, because there is no system of authority, system of hierarchy that's not imposed first by violence, and then that threat of violence remains as.
Okay, so that's a good point. The question of the imposition is different than the question of the maintenance. Imposition may well be by violence, so typically it isn't really. It's an imposition of one structure. It's the transformation of one structure to another. For instance, the landlord class in feudal England, some of them didn't survive the transition and didn't become capitalists. Others did. But they didn't have to persuade peasants to be workers in the same way, because peasants and workers were already occupying a lower strata, and so they were changing their location, so to speak. However, many workers, and we know this from the history because Marx was very much involved in this kind of history, and even before Marx, were fighting to overthrow the system itself. And then the violence has to come in. But not just the violence, the state. The church has to stand up and denounce you as evil, godless people. And your family has to condemn you. And your friends have to turn you in. That's what keeps you bound. Some people do escape that, and we know that how difficult it is. And we know this from the struggle. Just look at the struggles of black people in this country. The enormous length of time it took to make the progress that has been made and how much has not been made. And it's not because people there didn't think about it. It's because they were forced back into that spot again and again by social structure. And the obvious other parallel is women, historically. It's not like women didn't imagine, oh my God, I don't have to be brutalized and exploited. The question is what forced them down. And only one is physical violence. There are other factors, always historically. But this is a question for sociologists and anthropologists, but it's imminent in Marx's idea that capitalism also has a series of social mechanisms of reproduction of place. That's the point I'm making, of reproduction of place. Yes?
Going back to the end of the board, just really quickly before we go too far, I had a question. Like,
Trees. Trees
like
take
trees
you.
or whiskey or
Yeah,
aging.
trees or
So
a
how
really
long-
smelly cheese. Yeah, absolutely.
So then it will be a long time before they're able to even determine what the surplus would be.
Yeah, but see, you're assuming that you've started it and it's not an ongoing process. Think of it as an ongoing. Yes, the initial pioneers
Right.
have to take that time, and as we know, many of them fail. By the way, something like 60 or 70% of any business fails because they're doing the same thing. They're taking a chance that they're going to do this and it's going to come out at the end, not only with the product and nothing's going to go wrong in between, like a flood coming from the ocean and wiping out everything, like happened so close to us not long ago, but that you get there and there's a market for it. Right? Even that presumption, and I talked about it last time, about the presumption that somebody's going to buy your product even if you can make it. But yes, for all of those failures, there are also successes, and once they become success, then it is on a continuing cycle. Then, in fact, while it's true that the cheese takes 3 years to get to this fragrance level, every day you have cheese coming off that thing because it was put in 3 years and 1 day ago. That's
The
the
cheese
point.
does not stand alone.
Pardon?
The cheese does not stand alone.
No, cheese is not.
So, okay, so for every 10, let's say, cheese makers that go in to try to start making cheese, let's say one survives. So the one becomes a capitalist, the other 9 go back into the cycle.
No.
But we're talking about it, one
No,
series?
but that's not obvious. Let's suppose there are 10 capitalists who try. And by the way, there's about 6 fail, right? That's an average number, so 3 succeed. The other 6 who fail don't necessarily become workers. They can try again. They can try something else. It depends on how they fail, how seriously they fail, and how much that impacts their personal ability to continue. And class is more than money. I mean, Americans always find this really hard to understand, what the reasons that escape me, but class is much more than money. In England, you know this because you talk to a person and you know their accent. In America, the accent is not so obvious, though you can tell the accent of people who are from working class backgrounds and all of that, but it's not obvious. But there is a set of social structures that reproduces them and their children. They go to certain schools, they learn certain languages, they get certain training, and they get jobs, put them back in that structure, and that keeps them in their place. Remember the movie with Eddie Murphy called Trading Places? How many people saw that? So that's a movie exactly about this issue. There's no violence involved in it. It's all structure, all social structure. Okay. Let me move on because I want to talk about the second implication of this, which is the transformation of the labor process once it becomes subordinate to capital. Remember Adam Smith talking about the division of labor, the pin factory, and how people can all work together and produce many more pins, 10,000 pins in a day, when if you're working by yourself, you might produce 8 pins in a day or something like that, or 100 pins in a day. Remember that? You should remember that. It was on the midterm. You should definitely remember that. It was yesterday. So that pin factory example is Adam Smith's way of extolling the virtues of the concentration of labor that takes place when it is controlled by an external entity. An entity external to the labor, which is in fact, in this case, capital. Why would people want to work and produce 10,000 pins in a day? Well, they might not want to do it, but if you're a capitalist, you definitely want to produce as many pins in a day with as little cost as possible, because your profit depends on the difference between what you have to pay, the necessary labor time, and the length of the working day and the surplus product and surplus labor time contained in that. Everybody understand that? So this was not meant to be an abstract example. It's now become the foundation of profit. But capital by capital, it gets transformed into this incentive to squeeze the wage down, incentive for the capital, and to pull the day out and make it more intense. I keep saying that I'm going to show you the clip from Charlie Chaplin. I always forget to set it up, but we have it actually, of the Charlie Chaplin on the assembly line. And that is about intensity of labor, because the assembly line keeps getting faster and faster, and he keeps trying to keep up, and eventually falls into the machinery because he's trying to keep up with the machine, which can go much faster than humans. And by the way, the workers on the assembly line, and this is a point that Chaplin makes it quite elegant and clear, are very hostile to Chaplin disrupting the assembly line because their livelihood depends on that. This comes back to the point, who keeps you in your place? It's your fellow workers also. Okay? So Marx's first point is that the transformation of the labor process into a capitalist labor process, i.e. when he says when capital acquires command over labor, over functioning labor power, the labor itself, then the capitalist has to take care that the laborer does his work regularly and with the proper degree of intensity. That's a Chaplin moment. As producer of the activity of others, the capitalist, as producer of the activity of others, as a pumper out of surplus labor and an exploiter of labor power, it surpasses in energy, disregard of bounds, recklessness and efficiency, all earlier systems of production based on directly compulsory labor. This doesn't seem like it, but this is Marx's praise of the capital. The efficiency comes from the fact that it can push beyond all the bounds that other modes of production have been able to do, even slave modes, because it has the same push to reduce the standard of living, the same push to extend the working day, but it has this other push for the efficiency, for the speed up, because of the development of machinery, which we're going to come to. And here is an important thing that Marx talks about, which is the inversion of the relationship between labor and its tools. He makes the argument that when people are self-employed, in whatever limited degree, in a craft or something like that, then the tools are used by the laborers. And I'm not saying workers because they're not workers, by the producers. Right? They're the tools, and you work according to the social customs, according to the rule of your union, perhaps the craft union, but according to the rule of the master whose apprentice you are, and so on. But those are specifically related there, and they have limits typically. But your tools are your tools. Under capital, the relationship gets inverted, because the tool is the tool of the capitalist. It's a means of the capitalist to extract labor and surplus labor. And labor then becomes subordinate to the tool. It's the tool that runs. And this is exactly what the Chaplin piece is about, by the way. It's the machine runs the show, and the workers hop to fit the tool. This inversion has nothing to do with machinery. Absolutely nothing. It has to do with the use of the machinery. To put it another way, who's running the machine. I've made this point before, and let me remind you that all of you have computers in some form or another, even if you just have an iPhone or an iPad, but you certainly all have computers. And those are your tools. When you get your jobs on Wall Street, the computer will be running you. Because everything you do will be watched, calibrated, and recorded and managed from the top. And your relationship with the computer and other things around you will be the relationship of the computer belonging to the greater entity, which is your firm, and you working under it. Okay? Not talking if you are a hedge fund manager, but obviously if you have people working underneath that, definitely. Yes?
Would it be an accurate representation to say that, in a sense, the worker or producer, however you want to define, is essentially paying a rent for use of the tool to the capitalist with part of their labor?
No. I think it would be inaccurate because the tool already belongs to the capitalist. And workers don't get access to the tool, they have to work for it.
That's what I'm saying, like, that their labor time is essentially rent paid to the capitalist for use of their tool.
I don't know who their tools, I mean,
They're being the
confused.
capitalist's tool.
The capitalists own the tools.
Right.
So they don't need a rent for it, they already own it.
No, I'm saying that the laborer who uses the tool is essentially paying for the opportunity to use the tool, basically renting that tool from the capitalist.
That only be true if the laborer was a self-employed laborer. I mean, you can do that, by the way. You can go down to a tool rental shop. I do it sometimes to fix things in my house, and then I'm paying them rent.
But I mean, even as like a rank and file worker.
What about like a taxi driver? You pay to use the car, right?
You pay to use the car, but you pay it from your income that belongs to the taxi company. Your income belongs to them. They give you a portion, not the other way around. Now, if you're self-employed, yes, the taxi drivers are completely self-employed. So they're not working for a company, they're working for themselves. Then they're renting their tools, and they're paying that rent to themselves, by the way. I mean, it comes out of their income, their taxi revenue. But if you work for a taxi company, your proceeds of your labor belong to the company. You're not renting anything, they're renting you. That's the difference. They're renting you, and you get paid some portion of their proceeds according to the struggle of the taxi union versus the taxi owners. And that is a different kind of relationship. It's not a rental relationship at all. It's a payment for your ability to work, what Marx calls your labor power, in order to produce this surplus labor time. Now think about this. If you are a taxi, self-employed taxi user, a taxi cab driver, you know, your family's got one, you can do that, you can buy a medallion, and you work 8 hours a day, or 5 hours a day, because that's what you need to make, if you can't afford to do that, that you need. Once you work for a company, you don't have that option. You have to work the length of the working day that they can enforce, and you can push back on it, surely, collectively, but there's a length of working day. It's usually about 10 hours, 12 hours. In fact, they have shifts, 8 to 8 or something like that. And they get the money, and you get only a portion of your revenue. That's called a form of piece wages. So it looks like they're paying you for the piece of work you do, but only a fraction of the piece of work you do. And that's the same principle here. You have to work longer than the money you get. Otherwise, why would they want you? So you have to produce surplus. I saw your hand first.
I don't think he means literal rent. I think he means that the surplus labor that is generated machinery.
No, I understand that, but I'm saying it's not the same. When you rent a piece of land, you do it for your own purposes. If you are hired to work a piece of land, you're not paying the landowner rent, they're paying you a wage. And you have no choice but to do that as you are instructed to do. It's not the same thing as rent. The rent doesn't, see, you can't make rent such an abstract category that if you get paid for working for someone, you're renting their tools. First of all, you can work for someone without having any tools at all. They can hire your raw labor. That makes it very clear. You are being paid to produce an income for the capitalist and indeed to produce a profit for the capitalist. And they pay you from the return, not the other way around. You have to earn something for them, and more in order for you to be paid. What happens if profit falls? You get fired. They have to lay you off because your purpose there is to make profit, not to be employed. And that's not because they're bad people or something, it's just the purpose is different. So I don't think you can apply the category of rent in this instance, though there are instances in which you can apply the category of rent for self-employed people. Yes, I saw you.
Isn't the core difference that like the farmer would own the produce that he produces by cultivating the land? So the product would always be in the hands of the capitalist.
Yes, the product belongs to the capitalist. The capitalist
so
owns the product.
Yeah, this is the core difference, isn't it? Because like in the other case, the farmer like does get the product and then has to pay some rent, but the product is the product of the farmer.
Let's not mix up farmer and capitalist, so let's be clear here.
Yeah, I know. Like, of course, the farmer would be basically the capitalist, and that's the basic difference.
Or
But,
let's,
I mean,
make it more concrete here. You have someone who is a landowner. Let's not call this person a farmer because they're not doing anything, they just own the land, right? A landowner. The capitalist who's producing on the land and the workers who are working for the capitalist, right? The capitalist is the owner of the machinery and the tools and all of that. That's what makes them the capitalist. They own the means of production. They hire the workers. So in that sense, they rent the labor power of the workers for some period of time, a week or month or a day or whatever. That rent they pay for, that ability to use that labor power, and they have to extract it from it a profit. Now that profit, if it is too high, the landlord can chime in and say, hey, you're making a really good profit off my land, so in the next negotiation with your rent lease, it's going to go up. Or, you're not doing so well, but I want to keep somebody on here, so I'm going to bring it down. That's a negotiation between the owner of the profit and the owner of the land about how much gets to stay in the pocket of the capitalist producer and how much has to go to the pocket of the owner of the land. Now, obviously, a capitalist who owns the land keeps both. But it doesn't matter because analytically, one part is rent and the other part is profit. It's at least profit in the sense of net profit after rent. Same thing for interest. You borrow money, you have to pay it back. That comes out of your sales, but you have to pay back interest out of your profits. So you share your profits into profits for the capitalist, rent for the landowner, who could be the capitalist, and interest for the money lender, who could also be the capitalist. It doesn't matter who it is, these are different functions. Okay, yeah?
This case, would it not be used by capitalists to go against union?
Yes, of course it's true. Every capitalist understands that if wages rise, their profits are eaten into. Because I can't come to you and say, look, hey, I produce these wonderful mugs and I used to sell them for $6.99 at Bed Bath & Beyond, but guess what? My workers have raised their wages and now I have to make them for $8.99. And they go back, Bed Bath & Beyond says to me, thank you very much, but I can get them in China for 30 cents, so go to hell. I can't say to them, because my worker wages are high, you should give me more money. You don't go to the shop and ask for fruit at the farmer's market and say, do you want higher priced fruit because they pay their workers more? They sometimes do say that, but by and large, competition eliminates that. So the trouble is, the wages go up, your profits go down. So what does that mean? It means that capitalists have a powerful incentive to prevent this from happening. And of course, that's where the source of all the struggle and the counter-struggle and using the local police as well as using the church and the state and all of that to keep the wages down. But on the other hand, workers also have the capacity to organize to push back. And this is the point. The balance is not just arbitrary, because if you push back too much, you begin to lose jobs. That's obvious. If you say, if the workers demand a wage that closes the factory down, they've killed the goose that lays the golden egg, right? So the workers understand that the wage demand cannot be such as to eliminate any possibility of the employment. On the other hand, the capitalist will tell you that any increase in wage, I'm dead, I won't be able to survive, I have to close this factory, I just can't do it. So of course that's a bargaining element in it. And that is exactly the discourse in every union contract. They say we're going to go bankrupt, the capitalists, the workers say we're going to starve, and the struggle takes place in between. Sometimes the workers are starving, by the way. And yes, it can go too far. But obviously, at a social level, it can't go too far. Now, the question you raised is in fact one of the things we'll be talking about, which is a discussion in Marx about the relationship between wages and profitability and employment. It's in the section of the reserve army of labor. So it is in fact a crucial question, which we'll come back to. Okay? Question? Yeah? Okay.
So you're saying that the workers don't necessarily have the access to the...
Individually, they can get access. I'm asking you to think collectively.
Yeah, collectively they cannot organize themselves to do the same production activity without having someone...
Oh, no, I didn't say that. No, on the contrary, they can certainly organize themselves to do it. And workers have been known to take over factories. Who knows how to better run a factory than the people who run the factory? What happens when you take over a factory and run it yourself? You are violating the rules of private property. The factory doesn't belong to you, right? If you take over that factory, you're immediately going to bring down the police, the state, the church, Fox News, everybody who's important is going to come down against you. And that's what does happen.
So they don't own the tools.
They don't own the tools. It's not that they don't have the capacity to run them or even where are workers collectively going to get the money to buy all the tools in the United States? Where's that going to come from? From their personal savings? I mean, you should look at the distribution of income and wealth to see what we're talking about, the numbers we're talking about. That's how it keeps in place. Individual workers, sure, they can work their way up. And individual capitalists can work their way back down. That happens. But what keeps this diffusion process limited in the structure in place? That's the question. Okay? That's why I want to get away from the movie mentality. Yes, you might be able to escape from Sing Sing, but it's highly improbable that it's going to be you that's going to do that escape. Yeah.
So if workers were to collectively come together and like take over a factory and begin to produce, what would individuals?
But that is the economy. Why would there be another economy? Here's the question you're asking is a different one. Suppose that you have an island. We're an island, right? And all these guys here are the workers, and you're sitting in these capitalists smiling carefully over here because they're the capital class. And now you've been talking and organizing amongst each other. After all, you do the work, you run the factory, you have managers who have the same skills, and maybe some of them do a little managerial, but you can learn that. Anybody who's worked knows that you can learn that. That's not hard. So you take it over. Well, but you've taken over their private property. What's going to happen when you do that? That's theft. Punishment for theft is the force of the state. That's the last instance. Now, does the state going to come in and say, oh no, you guys are really the majority here, we really think that you should own the means of production? Well, that assumes that the state is a neutral, benevolent, or possibly working class entity. But the whole point is that social structures produce a state necessary for the maintenance of the social structures. It's not an independent entity. Just like religion becomes incorporated, the state also. The state has to enforce the rules. The rules are private property. Well, how are you going to get that private property? You can't. You can buy it, but then you have this little problem. How are you going to buy it? That's why when you talk about revolutions, you're not talking about buying out Bill Gates and the Koch brothers and all of that. You're talking about overthrowing them, but overthrowing them means against how? How are you going to do that? What are the means? This is an issue that comes up in Marx, obviously, very often, but not in the present discussion, which is about the production of profit. Because we're talking here about the conditions allow you to produce profit in the existing capitalist structure. But keep in mind that this is a structure always bubbling, always boiling with these struggles and fights and flares and violence. So it's not to be understood as a kind of harmonious neoclassical story. Okay, I want to make sure that I get to the key points, which I haven't even started yet. Well, we've talked about this, so let me now make the transition here. We're talking about capitalism taking over, but let's be clear about what we're talking about capitalism. Capitalism in Marx has to do with the dominance of a particular motive. Not the dominance in every sphere of life, but the dominant relation over other spheres, which is the profit relation. The profit relation. It drives capitalism. It's also the end-all of each capitalist. How do you know when you're successful? By the amount of profit you make. Not by your sales, not by how happy your workers are, or how unhappy your workers are. The measure is profit. But remember that profit can be negative, so lots of capitalists can fail. Roughly 60% of first-time businesses fail. So then that raises the question, what is capital? Several people here mentioned capital, capital in feudal society, capital in slave society. As the use of capital in Marx is not the same thing as tools. Capital is not tools. Capital is either money or tools or raw materials used to make profit. I've made this point again and again that you cannot tell the place of something by the thing. You have to look at the social relations. This is a use value to me, but it's an exchange value to Bed Bath & Beyond. Right? Because I bought it there and they're not interested in its use at all, except that it might persuade me to buy it. They're interested in how much money and how much profit they make from this, which is a lot, by the way. They make a lot of profit from this, but they make profit from this, and that's what concerns them. So if we're talking about capital, to me, this is not capital. It's where I keep the water I drink during class. It's a use value. But to them, this is capital because it's part of their inventory. And they have that inventory, which is the purpose of it, which is money that they use to buy this. And Marx has this circuit, which he described this. Capital is that which is within this circuit. You take money to buy something to sell for a bigger amount of money. For an expected bigger amount of money. You may be wrong, in which case you don't make it. So that becomes capital to them, but when I buy it, it's a use value to me. Is that point clear? That means that you cannot say that everything which is piled up is capital. I may have 14, actually I do have a lot of these in my house. They're not capital. They're just a lot of mugs, a lot of use values. They may be part of my wealth, but they don't become capital because I'm not using them to make profit. Secondly, capital is not something which lasts longer than a year. Neoclassical economics loves to translate capital into the idea that it's something that's durable. So if I don't break this in a year, it's capital. If I do break it in less than a year, it's not. From that point of view, anything that's durable is capital. Your education is capital. But I don't use my education, which is considerable, to make profit. I don't have human capital. It's nonsense. I have a durable set of qualities which I got through education. Now, I could use those properties to make money, in which case it becomes capital, but it's not in my case.
Are you not getting?
Wouldn't it be though? 'Cause
Fine.
You're a professor.
Yeah, I'm saying.
No, I don't use it to make profit.
That's not profit, but okay.
No, I was careful about that. Profit, not the same thing as earning income. I mean, from that point of view, every worker is a capitalist too, because it's not your skill, something that you use to make income. If you're a taxi driver, you're a capitalist. So in neoclassical theory, everybody's a capitalist if you're making any money, and of course in their argument you are making money implicitly or not. But this is not neoclassical theory, this is Marx. And Marx specifically says it's kind of, and rightfully I think, mystification to map back on anything that's durable, i.e. wealth, durable use values, and call them capital. Because then it makes it seem that we're all capitalists. We're all one happy family. Well, some people do better than others, but that's the way it is. We're all capitalists. Anybody who's educated is capitalist. Any worker with a skill is a capitalist because you have human capital. This is the deliberate mystification of the concept of capital. And remember we talked about commodity fetishism before? This is capital fetishism. And it's inherent in the sort of orthodox economic framework. Secondly, the other thing that's typically done is in the classical tradition, wages, rents, and profits are different categories belonging to different functional forms. Profit is the return to capital because You put in some money, and you buy here some tools, plus labor, and you get out here a product of 2,000. What's profit? Profit is the difference between the two. Now the point, the crucial point, is that the role of money here is very different than the role of money in your own personal use. So Marx has another circuit, which is CM, C. Here you start with, let's say, your labor power, meaning your capacity to work. You get a wage, and you buy your means of living. Notice that here money appears as the means to things that you need, whereas here things appear as a means of making profit. These are not the same. Hang on, I'm gonna let people catch up here. They're not the same because the purpose of the use of money, and I mentioned the point again and again, you cannot tell by the thing. You have to look to see the relationship in which it's inserted. The purpose of the thing is different. Now the same money can be, for me, here, I went to Bed Bath & Beyond, took my earnings as a professor, went there, and I bought a mug. So I'm in this circuit, that money. I gave the $7 to them. They, however, bought that mug for something, so used a certain amount of money, bought that mug, and they sold it to me for $7. And the difference between what they paid for the mug and what I got for it is their profit. The same money. They received this $7. It's part of the end of their circuit of capital. I spent this money, it's part of what Marx calls a circuit of revenue. Now I'm skipping over, I'm touching on lightly on things that we spend a lot of time on and have some incredibly powerful implications. But at least the layout here, the difference is not about the amount of money or not about that there are things in it, but the circuit in which it is. Let me just finish that point because I don't want to run out of time here. If for some reason along the way, this being New York, I get mugged by someone wearing a mask, a scary mask on the street, I don't get a mug. I lose my use value, right? But even if I complete this circuit and the M prime is less than the money I put in, I have failed the test of the circuit of capital, which is I have not made any profit, and that continues, then the whole set of things here, tools and labor power, will have to be dropped. Now that is not a physical relation, but a social one, and a particular social relation. I've made this point before, but not in this class I think, was that in the Great Depression there was a drop in employment which was very sharp from 1929 to 1930, 31, 32. Very, very sharp. What happened? What happened in 1929, 30, 31? Did the workers forget how to make things? Did they decide not to eat? Not to work? Did the capitalists decide that they don't want to do their jobs anymore? What happened exactly? What happened is, very quickly, the financial system broke, demand dropped, profits went negative. Profits went negative, they start to lay off people, demand dropped further, more banks went broke, more businesses went broke, and that downward spiral continued on. But notice that this is specific to the requirement that profit has to complete that circuit. The circuit was broken, and it stopped because profit wasn't there.
And here's a comparison with some other courses we're taking where the crisis of 2001 is explained based on the lack of consumer investment confidence, not because of profitability.
The key point here is it doesn't matter what the generating cause or the trigger is. What is important if a business fails to continue if it doesn't make profit, regardless of whatever the cause is in the macro sense. And I want to stay away from the causal question now. The point is, in this typical break, and it can happen in a single industry, why do 60% of businesses which are started fail? And the workers lose their jobs, and the people lose their investment, and the buildings go fallow? It's not because they're hit by a natural disaster. It's not Hurricane Sandy. It's a normal operation. When you don't make enough money, you can't continue. Enough money to make a profit. Even though you might make enough money to make a standard living, but you don't make a profit, then you have to close down. So that's my central point here, and it's very central to Marx's argument that the dominance of the profit motive changes the way the social structure operates. It changes the way production takes place. So we're going to talk about some of the other implications as we move along, but it changes the way the whole new system of capitalist production is completely different than the old system of, say, feudal society or slave, because the incentive structure is different. Some of it is there. The surplus labor part is still there. But the determination of the continuance principle and the weeding, the survival principle is different. Okay, yes?
Where does saving appear in the circle of revenue?
Saving?
Yeah, if like everything that we earn, we spend on means of living.
No, nothing says anything about what you do with this profit. I haven't said a word.
No, not in the capital, in the revenue circle. The left one.
Ah, well, okay, but I can add some here financial assets, right? I don't have to buy mugs. I can put some of the money into instruments. That's not a problem in itself. It doesn't imply that all the money you make it goes directly into buying use values. In my case, it's pretty close, but it doesn't require that. That's just a more concrete thing. That's a detail of what comes in this scene. Okay? And the same thing here, by the way, we can make many more details of how the money's come, different forms of money, but the point is that this essential insight is quite crucial. Yes? I'm sorry. Let me call someone who hasn't spoken yet, so first. Anyone? No. Yeah, Adam, go ahead.
Just
yeah.
from what Samar's saying, but if you are, in his world, if you're buying a financial asset and becoming an investor, aren't you becoming an indirect capitalist?
No, I don't think so. What does that mean? In a society, in any society, anything I do is indirect. So I'm an indirect person supporting targeted bombing through drones, because after all, I don't attack those people, and so I'm supporting them.
Maybe
but it
less
doesn't follow.
indirect than that. But I mean, if I own a share of Apple, I own a small piece of the capital of Apple.
But who's making,
You
who's making
really-
decisions to
Yeah, you
engage
don't make
in
the
certain
decisions.
capital?
But all you've done is lent them some money. So yes, in some sense, buying that makes you a collaborator, if that's what you want to say. That's correct. And people do have argued that by investing in Apple, you're collaborating in the brutal exploitation that Apple, not to mention buying iPhones, which is a whole other story, you're collaborating. And that's truth in that. If, for instance, certainly in my historical time, we wouldn't do some things because to buy those things or to lend money to them or anything like that was collaboration in what they were doing. Like in apartheid in South Africa, for instance. And boycott everything because it's collaboration. But most people are not, that doesn't mean that you are in fact doing those things. And in another way, most of what we do that supports the social structure supports the aspects we like and the aspects we don't like, right? So it doesn't make you a capitalist because you bought shares on the market.
But I still get a percentage of the profit.
Yes, you get a percentage of the profit. It still doesn't make you a capitalist. You get a cut for the money that you lent them. That's what you're getting. It's just a form of a loan. There's mysticism about you bought the firm and all of that. You can't call up Steve Jobs even when he was alive. And you certainly can't call him now. They're not going to listen to you just because you bought some shares. The issue is that you're getting a cut from their profit it's just a form of a return on your loan to them. Just like if you bought a bond, they would fund the bond also, which is another form of a loan, from their proceeds. Yes?
But isn't the core difference that your main source of income would still be your wage labor, and if wage is regulated to a certain degree, then as a wage labor you would never be able to really own means of production to to an extent that is
Well, individually, you might be able to do it, but as I say,
Yeah, but I
the
mean,
collective
okay.
problem is obviously you can't do
Yeah.
that. You can see why you couldn't, everybody couldn't do it, but individually people could do it. Yes.
I want to push back on this issue of human capital again. Just thinking, I mean, if you're using your money as a means of advancing the purchase of a commodity, you're going to hopefully.
No, but you're confusing raising your income and making money to make a profit.
Yeah.
And the whole point,
it would be a profit on the money I put into the.
No, it's not profit. The point in Marx is that just making more money is not the same thing as making a profit. And he's specifically arguing against this vision in which anything is the same as anything else because there's more at the end than the beginning. Or maybe more, something maybe less. He's arguing that there's something quite specific about the idea of making an investment in the capitalist sense. And the trouble is that we're stuck with the fact that, of course, neoclassical theory wants to make everything we do the same as capital. So, if you get an education, it's an investment in your human capital. If it happens to give you a higher income, that's a return profit on human capital. He's making the point that that's not the same. Because there's a fundamental difference between that and hiring 14 people like yourself to make money for you to make a profit.
So must you employ someone to be a capitalist? Is that what it is?
No, because you can employ someone to do things which are for sale, not for profit. You must employ other people to make money for you as a profit.
So employment is like a necessary component of capitalism, but it's not sufficient to be a capitalist.
It's one component in this circuit, but and this is a point I wasn't going to develop, but I need to do it now because you can lend money. Right? You can lend money for profit. That's what financial firms do. They borrow and lend money for profit. In this case, the employment that they have is just involved in trading, circulating of bonds and stocks and all of that. But it's still motivated by the key point that the issue is that you want to make a profit, which is not the same thing as more income. If I go to the dean and say, I need a raise, that doesn't make me a capitalist.
Right.
If I say, well, I did some education, I need a raise, it doesn't make me a capitalist. If, however, I hire 10 of you to build a house, pay you the wages I can get away with, and sell the results for something more than I put in, that does make me a capitalist. The point is that you want to try to avoid flattening out this thing so that the lowest common denominator is capital. That's the main argument against that. And the main point is that it's a fundamentally different relation. When you relate to yourself making more income, you're not hiring yourself. You're getting an education. You work as much as you think you need to do what you have to do. But no one's telling you that you don't have to eat. You don't have to, well, the new school is doing that, but that's a separate story. The force that comes and you work for someone else and they push you down, that's completely different. And that comes about because the motivation is different. Not the outcome of a possible increase, which, by the way, you may not get, just like capitalists don't get. But it's not the motivation of an increase in your income that makes you a capitalist. Because from that point of view, then any increase is a capital.
But it's just, okay, I was just thinking it was the use of the money
To put it
to,
To put it another way, like, if you receive on-the-job training, and that on-the-job training costs your employer takes away from your present income.
But keep in mind, when you pay for your education, who owns the income that you're going to get from it?
who owns it? I do.
Okay, so you're not a capitalist for that reason, because your proceeds are yours. Whereas if I hire you in a firm, and I train you not with the intention of your being happy with your income or your salary or your future life, though I may tell you all of that, but I care about the fact that you're going to make money for me, and the money I put into you does not belong to you. I will give you what I need to give you, but you don't own it. So you are then in the circuit of capital, as opposed to the circuit of revenue. Yeah. Okay? I have to move on, folks, because I have run out of time, but I wanted to say one other thing. So, from this point of view, the profit seems to be located in surplus labor. And that is traditionally how Marx is read. He's read as if saying that profit comes only from surplus labor. But in point of fact, it was known before Marx that there's another form of profit. Profit on a transfer. Looking at theories of surplus value, volume 1, chapter 1, the first thing in Marx's notes on other economists is an argument from James Stewart, Sir James Stewart, that says there's two sources of profit, not one. One is when you make the people produce the surplus product. You give them a certain wage for bushels, you make them work 12 hours, you get 8 bushels as your surplus product, you sell it, that's your profit, right? And that comes from profit on production, profit on extraction of surplus labor, profit on exploitation of labor, because you have to get them to work those hours and all of that. That's the traditional focus in Marx. But Marx already knows that there's another source of profit, because merchant capital, which precedes industrial capital, precedes industrial capitalism, is based on a different kind of profit. It's a profit. Remember we talked about Robinson Crusoe. Nobody ever reads Daniel Defoe, of course, but in the Robinson Crusoe story, we think of him as the ideal economic individual, and that's how neoclassical economics presents him, on this island busily stocking up and all that. It doesn't mention that, in fact, he's a slave trader. And he's a merchant capitalist slave trader. What does that mean? He goes to Africa, he captures slaves, he brings them to Brazil, he sells them, and the difference between what it costs him to capture them and trade them and bring them across the ocean and selling them is his profit. But notice, in this process, he's not produced anything. He's bought them at one price, he's acquired them, because of course they didn't voluntarily. He's captured and acquired them at one price, and he sold them at another price, and the difference is what Marx calls unequal exchange. Okay? Now this was already well known. I mean, any person with the 2 degrees of literacy would know that the history of merchant capital involved trading. Now, trading, for instance, you come to the colonies and you get them some stuff that in London is worth nothing, some mirrors, some steel, some knife blades, which are not available here in the same degree, and then you trade for that for gold and furs and all kinds of precious things which you take back to England, surviving the trip both ways. Not everybody makes it. You make a profit. That's merchant profit. But notice, in the process, you haven't added, as Stewart says, you have not added to the sum of the 2 wealths. You've changed their location, and in the process made a profit. Stewart calls this profit on vibration. It's a great phrase, profit on vibration. Because the product vibrates from between the 2 poles. From London to North America come the mirrors and the knives and whatever else they need over here. And going back, the precious metals, the furs, and all the other wealth going the other way. Notice, though, that the sum of the 2 hasn't changed. Whatever it was before, as before, you've changed the places. And you do it, it's only profit if you can do it on unequal terms. That's the point. So Marx already knows that profit can come, and he says this. Stewart is absolutely right, there are 2 sources of profit. But if there are 2 sources of profit, how do you separate them out? And the strategy Marx adopts, which is the same one that Smith and Ricardo adopt, is to begin by assuming that prices are proportional to labor values. Because then every exchange is an exchange of equivalence. In other words, by this device, he allows us to isolate the profit that comes from surplus product and the profit that comes from transfer of value or transfer of product. Now, just to make this point again clear, I'm just ending, I know, a little bit late. I made this point before. If you go home tonight and discover that your flat screen TV has been stolen, then you will have lost $400. So that person gave it to me, and I paid them $100 for it. So your 400 is now 100 for the person who stole it. I sell it for 400, it's 300 for me. It's clear, it's no change in the total quantity of goods. It's one TV, right? No change in the quantity of money. Minus 400 plus 100 plus 300 is 400. So nothing has changed, but this, my 300 is profit, whereas the minus 400 is a loss of personal wealth, and the gain of 100 for the thief, why am I pointing at Adam, I don't know, but the gain of 100 for the thief is a gain in the wealth of the thief. So the money is constant, the use value is constant, but because it's moved across the circuit of revenue to the circuit of capital, in the gain which is captured here is counted as profit, whereas the loss which is captured here is counted as a loss in wealth. The two add up, but you get this mysterious appearance of profit that seems out of the sky until you keep your accounts straight. Then you know it's just a balance of payments issue. The gain is here and the loss is there. This gain is called profit. This gain is called personal loss. And that's why you can have profit without production, without surplus value. Now this issue becomes crucial in Marx. He says, I'm going to deal with it later. And there is never that later. He's going to come deal with it in volume 3. He talks about prices deviating from values, therefore you no longer have equal exchange. And he says this has further consequences, but he was long dead before the volume was published, and we don't know what those first consequences are. But we do know that he already had the elements. You can therefore put the elements together. Circuit of revenue, circuit of capital, profit on alienation, transfer, what Marx calls profit on alienation, profit on production of surplus value, and you can show that you can always explain all these differences, like difference between profit and surplus value in the transformation problem, financial capital, and the source of these huge profits that come from IPOs and all that can be explained from this foundation.